Hello, everybody. I'm Glenn with ACGI. I'm Director of Leadership and Organizational Intelligence, and today is Cognitive Collaboration Part 2. And yes, we must break the golden rule. And what that means, if you remember Dr. Walker's presentation last time, was that the golden rule starts with the assumption that we have to treat others the way that I want to be treated. And the problem with that is that everybody's focus is on me. And so collaboration from the golden rule standpoint, which really is an inward mindset, is that everyone should know how I think and it's up to everyone to understand me. So the problem with the golden rule in collaborative settings is that it really is just kind of one person collaboration. It's asking everybody to be about me. The platinum rule is treat others the way that they want to be treated. And so this is where we become smarter than me. And the job of me as the individual and as the leader and as the collaborator is to get to know how others think and to understand everyone and to understand each other and to ask for the same in return. So cognitive collaboration comes from the platinum rule and an outward mindset that really is about us thinking about the way we all think and collaborating from our cognitive differences. Remember that cognitive collaboration is not collaborating in the boardroom, but collaborating in the brain. And we're going to use those differences in our neural habits and our preferences with the idea that if I have a different brain and you have a different brain, then we together have a smarter brain. And that's where we is smarter than me comes from. So again, we're going to be thinking of others' needs and others' challenges and others' objectives with that outward mindset approach that Alex talked about last time. So today we're going to get a little bit deeper into cognitive diversity and talk about a neuroleadership perspective of cognitive collaboration, and we're going to talk about an assessment called emergenetics. So let's first talk Roger Sperry. Roger Sperry was a neuroscientist that was known for his research about both hemispheres of the brain, the right and the left. And previous to his research, it was thought that the left hemisphere was really the dominant hemisphere. And what he actually found was that both the right and the left work in consultation with each other. Sometimes they collaborate, sometimes they conflict, sometimes they run in parallel. And each system has its own mini system of thinking and remembering and reasoning and deciding and emoting. And that's part of our human function in our brain. Roger Sperry studied the corpus callosum, which, as you can see from the images on the screen, this is a kind of upward image of a brain. You could see at the top of the screen would be where a person's nose is, and the larger part of the brain is the back of the head. If you kind of were to open up the brain in each hemisphere, you would see this white-gray matter called the corpus callosum, and it's essentially a system of tissues that connect the right and the left brains. And it was previously thought that that was really the job was to hold the brain together. But what Roger Sperry found was that that's actually a network where electricity and hormones and chemicals are actually exchanged between the right and the left hemisphere. That's what lateralization comes from, is essentially the exchange of energy or the exchange of activity between the right and the left side of the brain. So if you take something real simple like speech, for example, when we're talking, the left hemisphere is the part of the brain that is simultaneously choosing like our words and our grammar and the literal meaning of what we're saying. Now at the same time, the right hemisphere is choosing how we emphasize our words and how we have our tone and what our emphasis is. And those are happening simultaneously and sometimes in conflict with each other and sometimes in collaboration. So it's not really that we're left-brained or right-brained. We're actually both-brained, and those systems work together as a network. And Roger Sperry was known for his research in that world. Over time, since his research, we've evolved from images of the brain to diffusion tensor imaging, MRIs, which uses new technology to basically look at the corpus callosum, and you can see what that looks like on the middle image on the screen. And the Human Connectome Project looked even deeper at some of these fibers that connect the right and the left hemisphere. And you can see the colors of those fibers have like colors, and that's just to represent the type of different neuroactivity that happens in the brain in the right and left hemisphere. Now, over time, new technology has advanced so we can start to see 3D images of the brain. And as we start the video, you're going to see this glass brain project. This was done several years ago at the National Institute of Health, and you can actually see the corpus callosum in this image from a 3D perspective. This technology has emerged so we would actually see what's happening in the brain in a three-dimensional format. If we go even further, we can add video game technology to that. This is another video that you'll see real quick. This is an actual subject who's lying still, and she is just wiggling a finger and wiggling a toe, and you could see her brain activity in 3D format. The technology now fuses magnetic resonance imaging and diffuser tensor imaging. It also adds 3D technology, and as you're about to see in a second here, it also uses video game technology, virtual reality-based video game technology, to actually look inside the brain and see what's happening inside the actual brain. And again, this is a real image of a real subject that has the technology to be able to see what's happening inside the brain. The point of this discussion is that we now have technology to know that so much of our behavior is driven from the neural pathways in our brain. And quite literally, we can actually look inside of a brain and see what's happening. And Emergenetics brought in neuroscience and brought in brain imaging and brought in brain science to the concept of industrial organizational psychology and personality assessments for the first ever neuroscience-based assessment. And it helps us explain our personality and our habits and our thinking, not just from personality, which is a fairly loose construct, to something much more objective, that is neuroscience. So Emergenetics, emerge essentially means nurture, genetics means nature, is an assessment that looks at our patterns of thinking that emerge from our genetic blueprint and how we're socialized in our world. Doctors Browning and Williams were the researchers behind Emergenetics, and they essentially found 7 human traits that we can measure from an Emergenetics perspective that shape so much of our personality. And we're only going to focus on the things that are not purple. Those are behavioral attributes that we don't have time to cover today. We're going to look at the green, the yellow, the blue, and the red, which are our cognitive thinking, our cognitive preferences that Browning and Williams researched in the Emergenetics assessments. So when we look at those thinking traits, essentially we have all of these attributes to our brain, but we have preferences and we lean certain ways as different people. The blue part of our brain is the analytical part of our brain. So that's the really kind of logical part of our brain, the clear thinking part of our brain, the really rational and objective kind of research and data-minded part of our brain. We're going to call that blue or analytical. And all of us have that, but we have different shares or proportions of that in our thinking. The yellow brain is conceptual. So the yellow part of our brain is a little bit more abstract. It's more future-oriented and uses more imagination and pictures and images. It's the kind of visionary future ideation side of our brain. We all have some of that as well, but again, as humans, we have differences in how much of our preferences lean in the yellow format. The red side of our brain is our social sense, and that's really obviously about people and groups. It's our kind of intuition about how people are feeling and thinking. And again, we all have that, but what's different about us is how much of that we have in our thinking preferences. And the green part of our brain, which we'll call structural, that's really the practical part of our brain that is really about sequential thinking and logistics, really kind of sequential steps and very practical. And people that like to use the green part of our brain are really practical thinkers and like predictable types of processes. So when you get an Emergenetics profile, you get this picture that shows how much of your brain has preferences in which areas. And you'll see this is my personal profile. You'll see that when you look at my pie chart, so to speak, at the top of the page, you'll see that I have a lot of yellow preferences in my brain. That's the conceptual. Again, that's the imagination side, the visionary, the intuitive side of our brain. I also have quite a bit of red in my preferences, which shows that I like to think about people, and I kind of go there in thinking about how other people are thinking and feeling. And the blue part of my brain is really that analytical, data-minded, research-minded part of our brain. As you can see from my personal profile, the structural thinker, that's the kind of logistical, practical thinker, that's where I have to do a little bit harder work. It's not to say that I'm not skilled in that area. It really just means that I have to work harder at that area because that actually takes energy away from my brain when I have to think logistically and practically and things like that. So you can kind of think of the blue, red, and yellow for me personally as my comfort zone. That's where my brain likes to go, but I need to do extra work and work outside of my comfort zone to think in a practical sense in green. So for those of us that have blue preferences, again, we're going to be thinking about data and logic, and we're going to be thinking about pros and cons of things and cost-benefit analysis, and we're going to be looking up research and things like that. The green thinkers are really going to be thinking what the steps are, what's the agenda, what's the steps. You know, if you have a lot of green preferences in your brain, you would like to see an agenda for this presentation, for example, that looks like this. And if you have a lot of really strong preferences in green, you might like a more detailed agenda that is very logical and sequential and very predictable and has a lot of really discrete aspects to it that has a lot of more black and white types of detail to it. This is really pleasing to a brain that thinks green. It's not so pleasing to a brain that thinks yellow, for example, because yellows like to just figure it out and go with the flow. So again, the red part of our brain, or the social part of our brain, is really that part that's empathic and social minded, and it's intuitive about people and how they're thinking and they're feeling. While as the yellow part of our brain, again, is that imagination and vision and intuition about ideas. The people that have a lot of yellow preferences really have kind of gut feelings about new ideas and innovation. And those of us that have yellow, like me, we enjoy the things that are unusual and we like experimenting and things like that. It's a very visual and future-oriented part of our brain. What you see on the screen here is a real example. This is actually somebody I was personally working with, of a person who was accessing her yellow brain to do essentially a green task. And you'll see on the screen what looks like a bunch of random images. This is actually a timeline. If you look at the very top part of the screen, you'll see a fall 2015 and a kind of a timeline there. And each of those horizontal lines represent some kind of a track for different goals that the organization was working on. And when she was accessing the yellow part of her brain, she was trying to make a concrete schedule and a concrete timeline out of her ideas. And this is what she came up with. And as you can imagine, it still shows up as a yellow trait because there's lots of pictures. It's very conceptual. This is kind of a continuation of the images in the second picture here, where she's drawing mountains and images and all these things. Now, a person who's going to be really strong in the green isn't going to be informed really well by this, because this is still a yellow task being yellow. Now, if you were to give this task to a green brain who really enjoys that sequential thinking, she's going to be developing a Gantt chart or a spreadsheet or some kind of a sequential timeline to be able to do that. Maybe he's going to be choosing some kind of a logic model or something like that to really kind of lay out all the details. So this is just a really interesting example of what happens when you try to do a green task with a yellow mind. It doesn't always translate really well from one brain to another. So in problem-solving situations, the idea is that we have people with different thinking at the table, that we organize our groups based on our differences in the way that we think, under the idea that we is smarter than me. Because we need the blue brain to help us say, like, what's the cost benefit of this problem, or what's the research say about that? We need the yellow part of people's brain to really look at the big picture and brainstorm new ways and drawing up models and pictures. We need people who think green, that are really thinking of those details and the process and the timeline and the logistics. And we need people that are red-minded, who are really thinking about maybe who needs to be on the team and how's this going to impact people. We need all of that in collaborative settings, and we need to be different. Because we are unique as human beings, we have to capitalize on the differences and have to think of the way that other people think in cognitive collaboration settings. So let's stop for a second and look back to the Implementation Leadership Academy that many of you went through. You might remember that we talked about the different culture archetypes with the OCAI when we talked about culture as king, and we made the case that culture is always upstream from our strategy. You might remember the clan culture or the red culture, which is really about collaboration and loyalty and human development and a concern for people. You might remember the yellow culture, the adhocracy culture, which is really risk-taking and innovative and entrepreneurial and is really about innovation and focus on the future. You might remember the blue culture, the market culture, which is really that athletic culture and achievement-oriented. It's really aggressive, and it's about accomplishing aggressive goals and winning and beating the competition, things like that. And you might remember the green culture, the structural or hierarchy culture, which is really about rules and processes and procedures and a lot of control and structure and efficiency and stability in the hierarchy culture. One of the things I like about emergenetics is that it overlays so well with the OCAI, and it helps us understand some of the linkages between culture and the way that we think as leaders. You can see some parallels with the yellow culture and the OCAI, the creative culture, with the conceptual part of the emergenetics brain, that kind of idea-minded part of the yellow of our brain. You can see the relationship between the reds of the OCAI, where in the OCAI it's that clan, family, people-minded culture, and that's the part of our brains in emergenetics that also likes people. You can see in the OCAI as well that green part of our culture, the hierarchy and the processes and the controls and the steps and the sequential thinking of the neuroleadership perspective in emergenetics overlays really well with the control hierarchy culture in the OCAI. And you can see some parallels with the blue culture in both the OCAI and in emergenetics. Again, those are kind of analytical types of logistical processes. So I like emergenetics because it really correlates nicely with the way that we understand, interpret, and organize our organizational culture. So let's talk about some quick tips for cognitive collaboration. First, we're going to assess our team with the emergenetics assessment and do a training called Meeting of the Minds. That's a much longer training than provided today that actually shows you your personal emergenetics results and how to interpret them, and goes through about a day of exercises to actually learn how to apply all the emergenetics attributes to yourself as individuals and other members on your teams. And in that training, that's again about a full day, you learn how other people think and what their individual actual profiles are, and you get to kind of know your team from the emergenetics lens. Next, you're going to design teams based on your profile differences. And so when you put together teams, you don't want to put together teams based on their status or their position or whatever. You want to put together teams based on how different we are as individuals, and look at our cognitive preferences and make sure that we have cognitive diversity in our teams. We need a good balance between the blue, the yellow, the green, and the red overall in our teams. And one of the things I really love about emergenetics is you can actually combine profiles mechanically in the emergenetics platform and look at the profile of your overall team, putting 4, 5, 10, or 100 people together. You could look at your whole organization with emergenetics and kind of squish them all together into one profile and see how much balance and cognitive diversity you have on your team. And then third, we're going to try to think like other people and try to understand their thinking and their preferences and their point of view. That really is what cognitive collaboration comes down to. Using emergenetics is not the goal. It's really the means to the goal. The goal is to try to think how other people think, and then ask for the same in return, of course, and really get to understand their point of view and how they might be interpreting a section of a problem or things like that. We're going to do that in just a second with the skill building exercises. So then we want to develop and rehearse our cognitive collaboration skills. We don't want to kind of just learn emergenetics and then stop using it. We always want to kind of be rehearsing this and developing new neural pathways in our brain to learn how other people think. And so it's really important that we always rehearse the skills of thinking like other people and trying to put aside the way that we think for a minute and really practice those skills of learning how somebody different than us is approaching a problem or approaching a situation. So we're going to do a little miniature exercise just to start practicing the skills of thinking like other people think and practicing the skills of cognitive collaboration. So I want you to access the imagination part of your brain. So that's that yellow part of your brain. That's the part of your brain that's about pictures and images and kind of looking upwards a little bit and just imagining a situation that you might be familiar with. And let's pick a situation that is, maybe you're implementing an evidence-based practice, or you have a new program that you're implementing, and it's about 2 years old, and the energy behind the project is starting to fade away. You started out really high energy in this project, and people were really ambitious and really excited to kind of get this thing off the ground. And after about 2 years, it just started to erode and started to fizzle, so to speak. And our job in this situation, in this exercise, is to answer 2 questions. Number 1, what is this brain thinking? Number 2, how might this brain address this problem? And so the situation that we're in is we're on a committee. We're on our implementation team perhaps, or maybe we're on a leadership team, and we have to diagnose this problem of our implementation project just kind of fading away and fizzling out and losing its steam. And we're going to ask, what's this brain thinking if it were blue? What's this brain thinking if it were yellow? What's this brain thinking if it were green? And what's this brain thinking if it were red? We're also going to ask, how might this brain address this problem? How's the blue brain going to handle that? How's the yellow brain going to address this problem? How's the red brain going to address this problem? How's the green brain going to address this problem? This helps us practice our skills in thinking like other people think and thinking across all the emergenetics cognitive domains. So once again, our committee is going to have some blue brains on it, and they're going to be thinking from data, research, pros and cons, logical analysis. The yellow people on our committee, the people that really have a lot of yellow, are going to be thinking outside the box and creative ideas and new innovative ideas and experimenting with some things and stuff like that. They're also going to want to see pictures and concepts and models and things like that. The people on our committee that have a lot of strong red preferences, they're going to be thinking about the impacts on people and what might be going on in the feelings and the thoughts and the emotions of other people, including the culture of our organization. And the green folks are going to be thinking about sequential processes and logistics and steps and timelines and, the details that are really super important. So Dr. Walker is going to walk you through a quick little exercise to say, how is this brain thinking about this problem, and how is this brain going to address this problem for each of the 4 colors that we have in emergenetics?